Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the L. Ron Hubbard Theater in Hollywood, California. Tonight, we present a live broadcast of the Golden Age Radio Hour featuring L. Ron Hubbard's paranormal sea fantasy, The Devil's Rescue. The Devil's Rescue by L. Ron Hubbard. He had been cold so long that he had even ceased to dream of the great logs crackling in the old manor fireplace of his home. He just shivered now and then and ached, becoming conscious of the fact that it was bitter for a moment, and then relapsing into a blue ache which ate him from the mop of his salt-encrusted hair to his cracked feet. He had stopped courting the madness of envisioning great dinners he had eaten, recalling rather the peculiarly delicious flavor of the last biscuit in the bread box, which, moldy and inedible, had vanished to its last crumb some 2 days before. At the end of 60 hours, he had been exhausted with holding himself against the sick lurches, the violent pitches and whipping rolls of the 19-foot lifeboat. But now, he braced himself not at all, but lay prone in 5 inches of water and limply shifted with it from side to side. It was hell to open his eyes once the salt had formed over them. But some deep instinct in him bade him now and then to look up at the tattered ensign which hung upside down on the mast. The savage energy of the wind tearing into the red and white and blue wool wearied him, and again he shut his eyes. It was almost sunset. Sunset of his 22nd day in an open boat somewhere south and west of that ironically named place, the Cape of Good Hope. First, he had unloaded the cabin boy over the rail and into the gray restlessness of the sea. He had done it with great sorrow, although it seemed to him now that the important thing about it was how strong he had been. What determination had shone out of him that he would not suffer a like fate? How bravely had he braced himself against that oar, bidding the crew bend their backs until the wind shifted and he could set the sail. Then he had unloaded the cook. It had seemed strange that the fellow had not been able to live longer on his fat. And the wind hadn't shifted. And when dawn rose, the reason why he'd had to carry so much starboard helm the last hour became apparent, and so they had dumped the bow oar into the sea. That was all after the wind had started to blow straight off the Cape. There was nothing astern but auks, he told them. Auks and ice, and they had nothing to lose but their lives, which weren't worth much anyway. And so they dumped the bow oars' dead heaviness into the sea, whipped into a creamy froth now by the rising wind. About then he had ceased keeping track of the rest of the crew. The captain, had he not been dead on the schooner's house and in 100 fathom by now, would have kept a very punctual log about it. But not his mate. And then, a couple or 5 days ago, he had finally gotten tired of watching an arm swing back and forth from the thwart, and to still an urge which demanded to discover if man was fair food, hitched himself upright, and after an hour's work had managed to slide the body into the thick of a craggy wave which gulped and gave up its prey no more. He had stared in stupefaction then at the biscuit which floated upon the seawater in the bilge. He wondered that the boatswain had not eaten it long before, but the boatswain's loss was his gain, and so he had eaten. The foolishness of eating came to him afterwards, for eating would prolong his life yet a little while, and he was heartily sick of the way the boat kept lurching, rolling, pitching. If the sail hadn't blown away long ago, he would have tried to steady the thing with it. The sound of the wind had gotten into his head, along with the slap of a single halyard, and he was certain that he would never be able to get it out again. The sea, too, made far too much tumult. For each time a wave towered up its 40 feet, the wind hacked it down again and sent the top hissing straight out until the air was a horizontal sheet of water, discoloring the already leaden sky. Wondering a bit now at his energy, he put in a time at bailing, scooping up some water, lifting the can to the gunwale, spilling it out, bringing it back, scooping it up, lifting it to the gunwale, spilling it out, bringing it back, scooping it up, spilling it out, lifting it to the gunwale. He stared for a little at his empty hand, thinking dully that the sea must still be hungry after swallowing 8 corpses one after the other. A small part of him was alarmed, for now the boat would fill, little by little, at last to sink. The greater part of him said, with some relief, that, well, he wouldn't have to bail anymore anyway. Why he didn't get pneumonia or die of cold like the others was a problem which he would not now have to solve. That would save his head a lot of useless work. For a man had no right to live at all somewhere off Good Hope in the awfulness of its winter, with the ferocity of its gales and the chill of its water. Not even a bucko mate in the full strength of his 25 years. The streak of irony had risen up many times to aid him, and perhaps in it there was some small explanation of why he had outlasted those sturdy but stolid souls to whom death was simply death, and not a rather good joke on the unwary. After all, he pondered in one of his few wholly lucid moments, what more could he ask? For a good 5 hours he had a command. For when the mast had been shivered striking down the captain, it had been his lot to valiantly strive to keep the schooner afloat with pumps which took out only half of what came in through the sprung seams. And now again, he had a command, his solitary own, 19 feet in length, 7 feet in beam. And what mattered it if he was riding to the slashed sails and boom which made up the sea anchor? What mattered if now there were 8 good inches of water to slosh in the bottom, over the bottom boards continually, and over himself at least half the time? The clearness of thought began to seep from him, and he stared, half unseeing, at wind-split old glory. The whole thing was impossible. And he achieved the belief that he, Edward Lanson, was not here at all, that neither Cape of Good Hope nor South Atlantic existed. Somebody had made a very great mistake and had hung up the wrong scenery around him. He wasn't he, and the sea existed not at all. The dark, which dropped so slowly, coming down like the easy fingers of death, would take everything away, and he would awake in a dry bed to a breakfast fit for a sailor, knowing that this had been nothing but nightmare. He had dreamed the clammy flesh of the dead as he jettisoned them. He had dreamed the weeping of the cabin boy, who wept only because of the sorrow his mother would feel. He had dreamed even the Gloucester maid. He came to himself at the wrench of a powerful sea. It was quite dark now, but over him the wind screamed, and about him crashed the sea, unbelievable in its power to destroy, conscienceless in its voracity. He roused himself, for now the bilge covered his face at each roll, and though he could not discover any reason for not strangling, and thereby putting a swift period to the pain, it took less energy to lift himself with his back to the midship thwart than it did to force himself to lie and die. There was ice in the spray, which rattled against his back, and he fished listlessly around until he retrieved someone's southwester. The feel of it was clammy, but after a while, he got used to it. His chin sunk hopelessly upon his breast. He rode out the thundering hours, coming to himself now and then, and remaining for whole minutes with his wits more clear than they had ever been before in all his life. He thought of the time he had wasted, the countless easy hours spent wholly without purpose, and somehow it amused him to know that all men squander their time, purblind to the hour, often close at hand, when precious few minutes and seconds would be theirs to spend. The water was now up to his waist as he sat, a full 14 inches above the bottom boards, 18 from the keel. Its shifting weight made the craft stagger and take on even more, until sometimes half the gunwale was alight with a phosphorescent gleam of foaming spray. The movement pulled him back and forth, so that he had to brace himself a little with his arms along the thwart. He had not the strength to adjust himself completely. If he had ever been close to the shipping lanes, he was far from them now, beyond any possibility of rescue. As he was driven southward to approaching Antarctica, the days, each after the last, would increase their cold, and the wind its content of ice. 1,000 or 4,000 miles away was Hubbard. 1,000 or 500 directly into the whip of the gale which drove him off was Cape Town. Somehow it was strange to know that actual solid land was still in existence upon the planet, that ships still plowed the deep, that he still lived, while all these others were long dead. It must have been close to 11 in that wailing night when he saw a light. Raised high on the crest and then dropped into the trough as he was continually, it was a sketchy glimpse. Stubbornly, he would not allow himself to know it, for he full realized that the disappointment would be too agonizing for his remaining sanity to bear. And yet, each time he was hurtled dizzily in the dark to the foam-toothed peaks, he glimpsed the light anew. Before long, though still refusing to wholeheartedly support the sight, he began to ponder its source. for certainly it resembled no beacon, nor did it seem to be either a running or a range light, for its color was not red or green or white, but rather a pale yellow admixed with green. And it was not of one source, but rather of many. At last, he believed fully in it and reserved his judgment only about rescue, for it was not to be borne that a ship should pass so near without sighting him. Now, in these minutes when, believe it whether he would, he might possibly be hauled dripping from the maw of death, his mind refused to function, embattled in itself between desire and refusal to hope. Ship or land, whichever, it bore steadily toward him, growing better defined with each soaring heave of the sea around. It grew larger, but no brighter. He had known of men going mad in an open boat and seeing all manner of things, and then turning berserk when they refused to be real. And it seemed to him that some satanic plan was afloat to draw him into a few croaking cheers, after which the vision would vanish. But perhaps, if he still refused and did not cheer at all, then he himself would be the victor, outwitting the hostile jokester who saw fit to so work this thing upon him. He had averted cannibalism. Now, praise God, could he stave off madness? He would be cunning. He would rest his chin upon his breast and give no sign. And when at last it was too near to withdraw, he would seize upon it and so win his life. Thus, covertly did he come to believe in the thing, and his mind, freed from the struggle, kindled with the knowledge that dry in the locker in the stern sheets were 4 flares. Without betraying any anxiety, he made his way over the thwarts and lifted the cover. His hands were still and raw, and it took him some time finally to pull the cap from one with sufficient force to ignite the cap. Hotly it smoldered, blinding him when it broke into light. He was startled by the sight of the tumbling seas and the frailty of the half-sunken lifeboat. The enormity of his plight rose up into his throat. He shielded his eyes from the glare and again sought the thing. He could not see it so plainly now, but knew that it was closer. Strange, the outline it had taken on, for the whole affair was aglow, and it appeared to be nothing more than a triangle of pale fire. Certainly, no ship, however staunch, could plow directly into the gale, squaresails set even to topgallants. And certainly, those bluff bows and reaching sprit belonged to no staid grain ship, relic of far-gone days when sail was mistress. The warmth of the flare was good to his hand. He noted it. He had noted its feeling carefully, for he still had no faith in this thing. Reason stated that it could not exist, and if it did, that it could not sail in such a fashion. And if it did, it would never be booming up from Antarctica. But there it was, growing larger. And he fancied that above the yell of wind he could make out a repeated hail and the strain of creaking gear. Then, in an abrupt lull, he heard the thunder of slacked canvas, amid which a voice clearly cried, "Ahoy, the whaleboat! Stand by to take a line!" It was a trick of the mind, that order. It was a failure in his head that the old merchantman was standing to on his windward to drift down on him with the wind and sea. But all too plainly he heard the canvas booming now as it was momentarily spilled of wind. The flare did not seem to affect the strange glow which outlined the entire craft. But as the vessel neared, he saw that the sails were scarlet, not yellow-green, and that the masts were black, gleaming with spray. A line whistled by his ear, and a monkey fist plunked into a wave beyond him. He was almost afraid. In a sudden fit of premonition which stood up the hair along his neck to touch that heaving line. A moment's lull was chased away by the returning scream of wind, and once the hemp was in his hand, he was frightened at the thought of letting it go. Swiftly, he hauled it to him, unmindful of the pain of it through his raw palms. The hawser thumped on the gunwale, and he brought it up to carry it forward and drop it over a bit. "Haul away!" he cried, his own voice sounding thick but small. The jerk on the lifeboat slammed him to the thwart, and he hung on, staring up at the nearing vessel. Split apart as he was by the desire to continue his life and the knowledge that this was somehow an awful thing. At the rail were many faces, unearthly white against the glowing scarlet of the sails. Not a sound came from them now. He could feel the intensity of eyes upon him, and the atmosphere of the vessel reached out and clothed him in clammy garments. A line dropped down beside him, and he placed the bow line on the bight about both his seat and his shoulders, and presently, as the sea dropped away with his boat, he felt himself hauled swiftly up. Hands pulled him down from the rail to the deck, and ordinarily, at this moment of salvation, he would have given way to an intense desire to lean upon their support. But of their faces, he could make out nothing, save blots of glowing white. Not a word was spoken until one sailor, drawing his knife, made as if to cut away the lifeboat. "Don't!" cried Lanson in sudden horror. All faces turned to him. "Haul it astern. It's not much to tow, and it's my only command." The knife paused over the hawser for seconds, and then the sailor withdrew it and thrust it again into his belt. Lanson looked up and down the deck, anxious to confront an officer and be told that what he thought was untrue and that this greeting was only a trick of his exhausted nerves. By the mast, he saw a larger fellow, seated and seemingly disinterested, passing a marlin spike from fist to fist. A visored cap sat upon his head, and Lanson stumbled toward him, hoping that here was the mate, a man with a face. But the mate had no face whatsoever. "I am Edward Lanson, mate of the schooner Gloucester Maid. Foundered 3 weeks ago, or more, off Cape of Good Hope." The fellow turned up his featureless face and continued to pass the marlin spike back and forth. Finally, he made a motion with his head toward the quarterdeck, and Lanson found himself supported in that direction by the members of the crew. Any exultation he had felt in his rescue was spent now, for it was all too apparent that this ship, hemp-rigged, low of waist and high of stern and forecastle, should have ceased to sail centuries before. The crew stopped at the bottom of the ladder to the poop, and Lanson looked up to find a tall, nervous fellow there, dressed in an ancient Spanish mode, with the silver hilts of pistols protruding from his sash and rapier sweeping back in a thin, bright line. But here, thank God, was a face. "The Gloucester Maid, Edward Lanson, mate, sir." "Dead?" "My crew, sir. My crew and my captain, every one." The man on the upper deck took a restless pace back and forth before he faced Lanson again. The dark eyes flamed strangely. "This is ill done, Mr. Mate. Dead, you say? Everyone but you? Aye. Foundered on the Cape? Aye. And adrift 3 weeks on an open boat? Aye. You have no curiosity about the deck on which you stand? I would rather not, sir. I am weary. Of course. But you are a prudent man, Mr. Mate, and you would lie if you said you did not know that before you stands Captain Vanderbeck. Lanson's knees were buckling with exhaustion, and only the hands held him erect. Take him below. Give him stout wine, Madeira with a little pilot bread broken in it. When he wakes, give him food. He did not have to raise his voice to get above the wind. He turned about and paced into the dark of the quarterdeck while the sailors eased Lanson down a companionway and into a bunk. Presently one came and gave him the medicine prescribed. And then, when the door was shut and he was alone, Lanson let his head sink into the pillow, and out of him seeped all concern, fleeing before the delicious desire to sleep forever. When he awoke, he found that he could still feel the uneven lurching of the lifeboat. So long had he endured it. The motion was at variance with that of this ancient merchantman, and he made very unsteady progress out of the bunk. It was with some surprise that he found it dark outside his port, and he wondered if he could have slept through 24 hours. In any case, he felt very refreshed compared to what he had been. And he drank some more wine and ate a little pilot bread and began to wonder if there was any more solid fare that would be offered. His clothes had been rinsed, he found, in fresh water and now hung upon a rack, almost dry. He washed his sore body in a bucket placed there for that purpose and used a half of the bottle of salve which had been left beside the bucket. It cooled the salt-stunned skin and allowed him to move without wincing. All the while, the cabin kept going up and down and back and forth, duplicating the ceaseless motion of the lifeboat. Though when he steadied himself against these expected lunges, he only upset his own balance, which was overcome by the steadier movement of the vessel itself. In a little while, when he was at last dressed and ready, as though somebody had been watching him all the while, the faceless mate put his head in at the door. He said no word, but extended a scrap of parchment on which was written, "You will do me the honor and the favor of dining in my cabin. Vanderbeck." "What day is this?" But the mate withdrew without a word, and his sea boots left no sound in the passageway. Lanson turned to a mirror and nervously fixed the knot in his sailor's scarf. All his life he had had an uncanny awareness of time, so that no matter the circumstances, he was always able to count the bells without the aid of a watch. As he came more clearly himself, he realized that there was something very wrong in it being night. And though he had no true check of it, he felt that his sleep had been of at least 36 hours' duration. Remembering, he knew that he had awakened 3 or 4 times, each time to find a watcher at his side, ready with a warm broth. But it was all indistinct, as though it had happened to another. He combed his long hair with his fingers and then fell to studying his face, not really wanting to, for fear of what he might discover. But there was life in his dark eyes, color in his sunken cheeks and lips. No, there was no doubt about his being still alive. No more than there was any doubt about his recovery. He fingered the note and pondered on the captain's name, summing up what he had already seen and heard. And then suddenly he sank down on the edge of his bed and cupped his face in his worn hands. What release did he have now? Why hadn't they let him die out there alone? For it was quite clear to Edward Lanson now that he faced an endless life of storm in the company of a madman with a crew long dead. The door swung silently inward, and the impassive mate was there again, gesturing mildly that Lanson was to follow without more delay. Lanson avoided looking at the white expanse between cap and collar, at the fingers with their all too prominent joints. The main cabin was ornate, with carved blackwood furniture, glowing silks and oriental carpets. Along the bulkheads to either side were rows of chests, camphor and ivory and teak, from which drooled the luster of pearls or gaped a little over the load of dull gold coins. The ports were 20 feet athwartship and full 7 feet tall, all of cunningly set glass to make compasses and tritons and seahorses. Through this, trailing far behind them, glowed their frothing wake, leading off into the gray dark and the shrieking wind. Before Lanson paid heed to the occupants of the room, he searched for and found the lifeboat, planing behind them from its taut painter. Vanderbeck stood with his back to the companionway, staring gloomily through the stern ports. When Lanson touched the back of a chair, making a slight noise, the captain turned slowly. He had taken off pistols and rapier, and had changed sea boots for buckled slippers, but he was still garbed in black silk, which gave his face an unnatural glow. Wine? As you will. The captain waved him into a seat at the table, but he did not himself sit down. Watching the man's restive pacing, Lanson broke some dried fruit in his hands and chased it down with excellent port. You are a fellow of remarkable indestructibility. I might say the same of you. Yes, yes, that's so, I suppose. But blast me, Mr. Mate, if I'd enjoy 21 days in an open boat, dumping over the crew one by one. I'd rather not talk about it, sir, if you please. Yes, yes, yes. Of course, blast me. Of course. Good fruit, eh? Very tasty. Good. Good. Got it from a derelict named the Martha Howe. Captain must have been a fool to desert her. There she was, floating high, and where was he? Shark bait, most likely. A joke on the fellow, eh? Lanson drank a little more wine. Marvelous what one finds bobbing around. God love us, a man begins to believe that the accursed world is intent upon only one thing, giving all their riches to old Mancy. I suppose one would think so, looking at all these chests. These? Rubble, Mr. Mate. Rubble. I should show you what's in the forward hold. But here's the dinner. He sat down, and the sailor who had entered laid the board with smoothly mechanical motions. His face, too, was featureless. But what worth is it? It can't be spent. It can't buy me what I want. Have some beef. Lanson ate as slowly as he could, experiencing difficulty with an insane desire to snatch out with both hands and bolt everything in sight. Neither of them said anything more until they had finished, and the steward had brought forth some liquors and coffee. Vanderbeck sat back in his chair, examined his watch, comparing it with an ancient chronometer on another table a short distance away. While he was so engaged, a shadow was thrown in the path of the swinging lamp. Lanson's liquor glass slopped a little. The captain of the Gloucester Maid, recognizable only by his clothes, having no slightest feature from chin to brow, stood deferentially at Vanderbeck's chair. Lanson felt that he was being looked upon, but he tried to make no sign. "Course east northeast and wind strong, sir," said the captain of the Gloucester Maid. "East northeast. When do we pass the Cape?" "At midnight, sir." "Perhaps we'll not be turned back this time. Steady as you go." The Gloucester Maid's master touched his cap and withdrew. "And maybe we will. That's the only hope, to pass the Cape and be quit of this forever. Ha! Mr. Mate, we'll have a drink on it, for I very much fear that your own fate also depends on it." Lanson drank with him. "Perhaps," said Vanderbeck, growing more expansive, "he'll not even board us tonight." Lanson smiled. "Has he ever failed?" Vanderbeck clouded, glancing around. "Must you rob me of even the wish?" "No, he's never failed. Not in all these hundreds of years. But by this watch, he's close to 10 minutes overdue. That's unusual." They lapsed into silence, both of them waiting, Lanson knowing full well what was coming and why, and marveling slightly that he in his youth should be so wise in lore so old. He did not disappoint them, though the time had progressed almost an hour. There was a swirl of wind upon the deck, even louder than the already shrieking gale. The ship was, for a moment, in the grip of some savage force which strained at it and made it reel. Then came a sound of great boots on the deck, and a halloo for Vanderbeck. Vanderbeck stood still. The boots made the companionway groan, and the room was full of rushing wind and glaring light, and smoke, too. Lanson looked steadily at his glass. "What's this?" said an ingratiating voice. "Edward Lanson." "And who, may I politely ask, is Edward Lanson?" "Ha! Is he as good as that?" He laughed immoderately. "Mate of the Gloucester Maid. Or perhaps I should say captain, since he had the command for 5 hours. A cool one, my friend, and worthy of your notice. He outlives all the men in his boat." "By taking their rations for himself?" Lanson's face was very stiff when he looked up. The fellow in the dark, dripping cloak had slunk into a chair, and his pointed brows were raised, half amusedly, half cynically. "You do not know everything, I see." "You see! You see! 21 days in an open boat, and he comes up with enough nerve to bait you!" Laughter shook him so that, pouring wine, the bottle chattered against the glass. He was not cross. A leer of disbelief appeared upon his tapering face. No man, my young mate, has any such remarkable power of self-sacrifice. I should know, for, after all, I govern the lives of more than you suppose. But not mine, and so I'll not be made to take that lie, though I can't say that your good opinion is of any great importance to me. Vanderbeck poured brandy all around in his enthusiasm. He looked put out, and not at all pleased with what Vanderbeck had done. This was poorly thought of. What can I do? You rob me, one by one, of those I get to man her. Even tonight, the time of 5 is through, and so they leave with you. And when I go to the work of lying too, should I desist because, wonder of wonders, he is not dead? What else can he expect now? You'll give him the same chance as others. He boards me, and he is not afraid. Nor is he even afraid of you, and therefore you wish him ill. He'll have the same chance, I say. He peered at Lanson with shifty eyes, but Lanson only sipped his brandy and did not blink. He despised the fellow from the nethermost reaches of his soul. After a little, he got up and wandered about the room, opening the chests and regaining his good spirits by laughing at the contents. The sight of gold and gems reacted upon him like a colossal prank. Finally, he took heed of the chronometer and sat down at the table again. From inside the cloak, he took a great dice cup and, wrapping his long fingers over the edge, made the cubes dance. Always your dice. As the years go by, I trust you less and less. Ha! You think my dice are false? Here, inspect them. What good would that do? But this time, won't you use mine? And be certain then that they are false? What a child you think me, Captain Vanderbeck. High man for first. As you will. Promptly he rolled out 4 6s and a 5 and sat there grinning, while Vanderbeck took the great box and made the cubes rattle. When they fell upon the cloth, they showed but small numbers. Shoot first, then, and be damned to you. This night I'll pass the Cape, that I swear. Have you not sworn too much already, perhaps? Vanderbeck flushed. He rolled the dice and got 3 5s. The remaining 2 bounced forth, and one of them was a 5. The last was also a mate to the rest. 5 5s, he grinned. Shoot 5 6s now and pass the Cape. Yes, shoot 5 6s or 5 aces and be free of it. Rattle them well, Captain Vanderbeck, for again you near land after long cruising. Fail, and you are mine for 7 years more. Vanderbeck's eyes were overly bright. You've never been beaten. You have no concern. And it only amuses you to let another try. But here, I'll shoot, and to hell with you. The 5 dice leaped from the box, and when they had quieted, they read 2 6s, a pair of 4s, and a deuce. Vanderbeck's hands shook when he laid the 6s aside and put the trio back in the cup. Thoroughly he shook them. Savagely he threw them. 2 more 6s came to view. He was still grinning, self-assured. It amused him to see the moistness of Vanderbeck's hands and the tremble of the captain's lip. Vanderbeck sent the die spinning round and round inside the cup, and then, as though abandoning everything, let it fall to sight. He He began to laugh in a quiet, horrible sort of way. Vanderbeck's eyes were starting from their sockets, and he appeared to be on the verge of insanity. Lanson whirled the brandy around in his glass with small motions. 4 6s and a deuce won't do it, I'm afraid. And so, you're mine another 7 years. But worry not. Again, I'll bless your ship. She shall not founder. No, she'll carry you through the storm of winds which blow around the bottom of the world, and will not meet again until your time once again has come. And so, good voyage to you, Captain Vanderbeck. Collect your crews upon the sea and send them on when their time is done. After all, you gave ship and self to me to win against these seas. You won, you see? And so, goodbye, and good sailing. There's the matter of myself, said Lanson quietly. He dared not hope. After all, I had no part in this and offered nothing to the sea but my own small strength. I come here only by chance, and you have no right to keep me. Blast me. That's true. Much as I like you, Mr. Mate, I like you a shade too well to have you so condemned. Come, you. He'll have to have his chance. He regarded them a little uncertainly, and then smiled in an oily fashion, slipped sideways into the chair once more. You really want to be given back to the sea, Edward Lanson? Rather that than this. Then you do not like my service? I did not ask to enter it. His eyes shifted from the direct stare, and he again produced the dice cup. But let it be understood what you do. You shoot for your freedom, and I for your soul. Is that correct? Lanson sat up a little straighter and took a hitch on his nerve. Yes. High man shoots first. And he rolled 4 6s and a tray. Lanson took the box, stared at it for a while into its depths, and then stirred it up. He tossed it and got a hodgepodge of small ones. He took the box again, rotating it slowly, all the while grinning triumphantly at Lanson. When the dice spewed forth, there were 3 aces, a 4, and a deuce. His quick hands tossed the 4 and the deuce back, and when they leaped out again, they were an ace and a tray. He placed the 4th ace with the first 3, and the die went round and round inside the cup while he enjoyed Lanson's strained face. Then it bounced to the board and teetered for a moment between an ace and a 6, and then it fell. The ace on the side. He shrugged. 4 aces to beat, Edward Lanson. But even if you lose, I am not such a hard master. I have not lost, said Edward Lanson stubbornly. He made the dice clatter in the cup. With a twitch of his wrist, he scattered them on the green cloth. 2 aces were there to be set aside. He tittered. Go ahead, Edward Lanson. As you say, you have not lost. Lanson rattled the 3 dice savagely. He spilled them, and when they had stopped, only 1 was found to be an ace. Keep right on. Not even yet have you lost. Lanson shot him a contemptuous glare. The 2 remaining dice leaped about in the box and then bounced swiftly forth. Vanderbeck leaped up so suddenly that he upset his brandy. You see! You see! 2 aces, and that makes 5! He shot 5 aces and he's got you! Then you can be beaten! You can! And 7 years from tonight, when we again come near the Cape, We'll see! But a strange thing was happening to Lanson. His evil face was beginning to fade. Vanderbeck was beginning to fade. The very tapestries of the room were glowing indistinct. The steward who waited in the door became only a bony thing and then a shadow and finally vanished altogether. The beams overhead grew as transparent as glass, and even Vanderbeck's voice was drawing far off. The face was gone. The chests were gone. The table and the beef were gone, and then the deck under his feet was nothing, and he began to fall. The water was a bitter shock. A hungry wave towered up and dropped its tons of froth upon him. He came to the surface gasping and struck out wildly. Encumbered by his clothes, smothered by the sea, deafened by the wind. Something white beside him was bobbing, and he clung desperately to him. The solidity of the canvas-wrapped spar was reassuring, for he knew it as the sea anchor. More calmly now, he worked himself up the line to the lifeboat's bow, discovering that he was only using one hand. It took some time for him to get over the lunging gunwale, but at last he lay in the half-swamped boat, gasping with relief. Presently, he pulled himself to the midship thwart and lay out flat upon it. There was something to which he had clung, and now he gazed wonderingly upon it, finding that he still held a dice box. Overhead, the winds that howl around the bottom of the world tore spray straight out from the crests of every wave until a solid sheet of water was continually in the air, back and forth, up and down, rolling, pitching, and staggering. The lifeboat floundered through the gale. Lanson got in the sea anchor and hung its beribboned canvas upon the mast as best he could, the while glancing about for any further sign of the spectral Flying Dutchman. But the sea was clear. And after a little, he lashed the helm upon a northerly course, gripping the dice box with a stubborn hand and kneeling upon the buried bottom boards. Edward Lanson began to bail.